Tell the people who you are.
Hi, my name is Stephen Canals, and I am the co-creator and EP of Pose, which airs on FX.
Awesome, amazing, beautiful show. Let's talk about writing.
Let's talk about
All right,
writing.
just before I hit record, you were telling me that you're currently in a writer's room on Zoom.
We found a process that works for us. We do a lot of texting and emailing each other. We have a very small writer's room. So the Pose room there are only 5 of us.
Yeah.
And the 5 of us who are in that room, myself, Ryan Murphy, Brad Falchuk, Janet Mock, and Our Lady J, have all been working on this show since the very beginning, since season 1. We're so familiar with the show and the characters and the world, and it just creates a shorthand. Even when we're on hiatus, and I think in a lot of ways we're treating this period of time like our time in between seasons. We FaceTime quite a bit, and then we have a Google Doc. Everybody has access to it, so we can all be writing in real time and seeing what everyone has to say about our various documents, whether it's, a beat sheet or an outline, which is great.
So as we're chatting, I think we're heading into about week 7 for most people of being home. There's a stay-at-home order here in LA. I don't know about you, but it's been like a marathon journey for me since I've been home. Lucky to be employed, lucky to be in a room that's up and running. A lot of pressure to keep going at the same level of creativity and productivity. And I feel like I lived a lifetime since the pandemic really hit California, of some days being really anxious, checking the news too much, some days being productive. But in general, I have found it takes me longer to write. If I could bang out 3 or 4 scenes in a day or in a block of time, maybe it's like 2 right now. What about you? It's okay. You don't have to make me feel better if you're doing better than that.
No, I am not doing more than that. Trust me. I spent the first 2 weeks feeling really good. Although we were in the midst of filming season 3, and unfortunately, we were put on hiatus, our production was shut down. And so, when I returned to LA from New York, I was still feeling really productive. And I've maintained that energy when it comes to working on Pose. But that's really it,
Right.
Typically I feel like I have a reserve of energy. I've just been so creatively spent. I have a theory for why that is the case, though.
Tell me.
I think from my sample size of just people I know who are also storytellers, most writers, I think, would say that they lean toward being introverts. But the reality is that the only way for us to really, truly be able to dig into the core of who a person is to actually be out in the world experiencing life, right? So whether it's that we're interacting with people face to face, or whether we're just sitting in a cafe and overhearing people's conversations, that is what feeds us as storytellers. And right now we don't have access to any of that.
It's really dramatic what you're saying, because I'm very much like that. I love to write in cafes. I bring noise canceling headphones, I put them on, and then I don't turn them on, so I can just eavesdrop the whole time.
Love that.
Yeah, I'm brutal. It's like, don't sit near me at a Starbucks. You'll just end up in the script. I love that feeling of being among people, not necessarily interacting, but observing.
Yeah, I mean, we have to work that much harder at being connected.
Yeah, I know you've told the story of how Pose got made before, and you've told the story of how you were a writer who was working to break in, and you were writing specs, and you were thinking about what you wanted to write about. And if you can give us just the very short form of what that looked like, because I think it's interesting to talk about that time in a writer's career, and it might happen more than once, where you have to be a self-starter, you have to self-generate material, you have to even decide what you want to write about in a world where you could have a million ideas. I'm really interested to hear about what that process was like for you.
The Pose journey began in 2014. It is when I wrote the original draft of the Pose pilot. I was in my second year in the UCLA MFA screenwriting program. It was only the second drama pilot that I ever wrote, because I was feature focused in the program, and folks kept telling me, you're writing all these like character driven stories, and we're really not seeing those types of stories have a life in the feature space. But obviously, like, folks are telling those stories in television, so you should pivot. And I was very resistant to it. And so finally I thought, okay, I'll try it. And so I wrote the Pose pilot, immediately went out into the industry because, just through having connections from UCLA, there were plenty of folks who were like, look, we're going to send your script around
Mm.
and immediately received feedback from two networks that shall remain nameless.
Mhm.
But they both said this isn't very good. And uh,
What words did they use?
I don't know who the audience is for a show like this. I don't know where this show lives, you know. So it was all that feedback, and so receiving that right out of the gate, I thought, okay, well,
Mm.
I guess this isn't the golden ticket that I thought it was going to be.
Right.
And so then I just kept writing other pieces. Little did I know that this pilot continued to circulate, and so it was maybe 8 or 9 months later. It happened to land on the desk of an exec who loved it so much that she sent it to all the managers that she knew. And then suddenly, you know, I was receiving calls from managers saying, hey, we want to rep you. And even after that, it still took a solid year before I then meet Sherry Marsh, who's one of the executive producers on Pose. I should note that that original draft of Pose helped me to get managers and agent. It's what helped me to get staffed on my first show. The pilot was opening up a lot of doors for me. It just wasn't keeping me in very many rooms. You know, I just think that the show was seen as being it was too risky, you know, and
Hmm.
this is a risk averse industry, as you know. And so
Yeah.
it really wasn't until I met Sherry and she said, okay, like we need to really go out with this very seriously. And so we worked on a pitch for about a month and a half. And within, I think, 2 weeks of going out with this pitch, we wound up hearing from Ryan Murphy, who he was working on a show about the ballroom community as well and had just acquired the rights to Paris is Burning. We go in to meet with him and he says, look, this shocked me about him, by the way, because I really, you know, I mean, I met with Ryan a week after he had won a slew of Emmys for People versus OJ.
Like no
So
pressure.
at all, like I was a nobody, right? Like I had been a staff writer on one show. It's like he really didn't
Hmm.
need to meet with me at all.
Hmm. Hmm.
But he brought me in and within 10 minutes of our conversation, he says, look, I just acquired the rights to Paris is Burning. You have an original pilot that you wrote. I don't really see a market where we go out with competing projects and they both get made. Like we already know how this industry works. Like this is a show
Hmm.
about queer and trans people that are also Black and brown. It's a period piece. Why would we set ourselves up for that kind of failure when we can just come together on this
Hmm.
project? And so that's how it happened. Kind of a Cinderella story.
I mean, everyone starts out writing samples and we all write originals and we all get a version, I think, of the same speech if we're lucky enough to have agents or managers. And they say, you know, you want to write the thing that you believe in, but also do not count on it ever getting made. It is supposed to function as a sample for you.
I'm a Virgo, so my unsolicited advice for all of those, you know, nascent storytellers is like you just have to have an inner compass that tells you I'm moving in the right direction. Like as long as you know that
Hmm.
you're going north, there's no way to control the path at all. The reality is that like this career is a lot like fumbling in the dark.
I feel like it's such a long game to be a writer, and we just don't get to know what kind of writer we're going to become when we start because there's just so many hours and so much effort goes into becoming good at it. We should just downplay it because no one will start. You know, it's like a
Hello.
lifetime of a journey. Partly because of my experience, but also talking to people like you and just watching people become the writers that they're going to be. They're just following a little impulse. Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you remember what that impulse was inside you where you were like, this is the kind of story? And, you know, I have to write a sample. I've been told I'm a character driven writer who would benefit from long form storytelling in television. And then you're like, queer, trans, people of color, the 80s, right?
I mean, I went into UCLA knowing that it was going to be really important for me to center the narratives of three groups: women, LGBT people, and people of color. I need stories to sort of check one of those three identity boxes. I'm
Mm-hmm.
fortunate that Pose actually checks all three. It's like I
Mm-hmm.
want all of my stories to constantly honor those groups that often don't get a ton of real estate in film and in TV.
I think this word you used, honor, is such a beautiful word for it because, you know, I've talked to many young writers who feel a certain extra pressure. You know, if I had a magic wand and I could erase it, I would, because I'm usually hearing that from someone who is exactly the kind of storyteller we need more of. You know, people who have had marginalized experiences and want to tell about them, you know, want to talk about them and want to explore and become fantastical and just tell their story their way. And frequently I hear about a sort of pressure that comes along with the idea that representation is being achieved. And when you said the word honor, something just lit up for me as sort of a way to approach that's somehow a little gentler in the writing process. I think that so often it's about like turning off the voices that are harsh for long enough to just get a page down. Do you feel that when you're writing? Do you have a committee in your head?
Always. Always. Well, first I have to shut off the voice that's telling me you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not talented enough.
How do you do it? Teach us.
You know, it's taken honestly, it's taken such a long time. Here's the thing, it's never really off.
Right.
Have you ever read the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert?
Yeah.
And so she says that if fear was a person, you know, they're always in the back seat of the car with her. But she's very clear when she's driving, you have to buckle in, but you don't get to be a backseat driver. So you can be here, but you don't get to speak. And I know you know this, you know, when you're working for a studio and a network and you have, you know, a production and actors who are waiting for pages, like you just have to produce. Like you don't have the luxury to sit back and say, today it's just not happening. You know, it's like, you got to put something on the page. And so there are days where those pages go out and you're like, that's not my best work. And I know that, you know, and then there are some days where like, I feel really confident and I'm just like, you know what, you can shut up. I don't want to hear you. You know, it really just depends on the day.
Professional writers who have to put pages out, essentially, this is the lane that we've picked, the lane of productivity, if you really boil it down. Like I actually remember very clearly being on my first staff with John McNamara, who was a seasoned showrunner by that time, and I was the greenest person he'd ever seen in his life. I remember a day that we were in prep and something fell completely apart. And no, we were shooting and something fell apart. And he called me into his office. He was on the phone. He was like dealing with putting out fires and he was typing. And then when he typed the page, he just turned the computer around and handed it to me. And I realized he expected me to sit there and rewrite it as he dealt with the calls and then pass it back to him. You know, when I had turned in my first script, I like stayed up all night reading it. I went away and came back. I had a writing partner, so it was actually a little easier for me than some. At least there was one more person in the bubble of panic and despair. But I was so precious about it. I remember the moment it clicked where I just handed my best effort of that moment back across the table. And I was like, fucking television is magic. It just takes the preciousness away. It's demanding of me the best I can do today. And then that's it. Like then the best you can do tomorrow. And then let's see what it adds up to. You know?
When did you have the moment where you realized that you're not alone in this process?
You know, for that, I definitely came into being a professional writer with the sense that I should be as perfect as possible and just act like everything was fine at all times. It took me a long time to be honest about that in real life. But reading, you know, people like Elizabeth Gilbert and Brene Brown, people who write about being human.
The text that I go back to often is Bird by Anne Lamott.
Oh, that's such a good one.
First chapter, writing shitty first drafts. You know, it's like, it's so freeing. We have to be kind to ourselves. And actually, I think that this is really key to how I think I got out of my funk / creative rut during this period of isolation, which is reminding myself that I am a human, I have limits, and I'm not perfect. And so, yeah, there are going to be some days where I'm going to wake up and I'm just not going to be feeling it. You know, it's going to be really hard. The words are not at my fingertips, and that is okay.
Do you have a cheat or a hack for when you need a shot of confidence? You know, if I were you, I might be like, let me just go on my IMDb page and see how many awards Pose has been nominated for example, right? But I'm wondering if you have some that are not contingent upon having a widely respected TV show for those who are watching this and don't have that yet.
I'll try that, but I haven't done that yet. I haven't done I'm going to go to my IMDb page. I'm going to, you know, I mean, to be frank, the success of Pose to me just adds an added layer of pressure. Like I've always been my own worst enemy. I know that. And I think I'm always sort of trying to eclipse what I feel is my best. Sometimes it's hard to gauge that. And I think Pose is a really good example of it, where even after we aired and the accolades began to come in, I was always like, wow, people really love the show. Like it was shocking to me.
I mean, the reality of production is that you're really lucky if 65% of what you intended ends up being shot the way you've envisioned it. I have the same thing where it's really hard for me to watch anything I had any part in without picking it apart and seeing all of the missed opportunities. But I know what the ice cream is for me. And it's different on every show. But I know what the delicious thing is that is like my personal little reward for working so hard on something with so many people. And for The Magicians, which recently wrapped, just creating monsters is so my thing. And so I just always endeavored to be on set, fly to Canada and be on set if a questing creature was going to be on the show, which generally means several weeks of designing and then prosthetics, and then the actor's been in makeup for 8 hours, and like those moments where I'm like, oh my god, he's 7.5 feet tall, he has hooves and horns, and he's covered in kittens. Like, this is exactly what I wanted. So I give those to myself.
It's funny. What I would say that I think my ice cream then is, and it took me a while to allow it to be ice cream, is when I have young fans of the show stop me to tell me what the show means to them. Funny enough, it was actually during a press junket for Pose. It was for season 2. I happened to be sitting at a round table with 6 journalists. And the first question that I was asked was, do you understand how important this show is to the queer community? And I don't know why, but I had been asked that question so many times, but for some reason on this particular day, it was like I'd heard it for the first time, and I had a full meltdown, like full ugly cry in front of 6 people. And I'm usually like, I'm not a big crier. Like, that's just, it's not typically like my go-to emotion. And so I wound up having a conversation afterwards with one of the journalists, and the thing that he said to me that stuck with me, really resonated, was, it's okay for you to receive a compliment. Like sometimes people are going to want to just tell you what you've done has meant a lot to me, and your only job is just to receive it and to hold space for them. And that has really changed everything for me. And so all that to say, I think for me, the ice cream has been holding space for other people when they're like, I need to tell you what the show means to me, just receiving that energy and saying thank you.
I wonder if you felt this way, that it feels like a risk to me, even though no one ever has to know that I'm writing something very, very personal. They don't have to know that this scene is personal and that the scene directly preceding it has nothing to fucking do with me.
I mean, but the thing is that it's personal for everybody. It relates back to like the story you literally just told about flying up to Canada and then seeing the actor and all their prosthetics and knowing that that's your perfect vision for that moment. Like all of that is equally as important and personal. It's all personal. And I think that's the key to success. I think the reason why you were able to have 5 successful seasons is because it was personal.
I've been talking to people for the last couple of weeks, writers who have all kinds of incredible shows and books. And that's something that I think we all have in common, that we just went there. And that wasn't always the case in the TV business. I think that when writers are trying to break in, there's a necessary voice that comes in that's just wondering about the marketplace. And, like, will this put me in a category that makes me more staffable? The story that you're telling is about somebody who didn't really know when you wrote. You knew you didn't see that out there. You wanted to tell that story. You had no idea. And you got both responses. You got the no response before the yes. I will just say it's something that I'm incredibly grateful that TV has moved in this direction in the last few years. Because when I got in, it was just all, well, we'll check out the carpet fibers in the lab. And we'll find the perpetrator. I was like, maybe this is the new, task that's set before writers that they can really do right now while we're at home and we get to write whatever we want and put it in a drawer or show it at the end of all of this, to dig deep in the way that you've been kind of describing.
When I was growing up, my dad and I had like a really complicated relationship, and film and television was our universal language. Like that was the way that we communicated with one another. And so I think what's so important to me when it comes to story is that film and television finds a way to uncover our truths, but also at its core always has this, I guess, underbelly of wanting us to be connected. I mean, Earth as a whole, like it's a communal space, right? And like we all participate in making it what it is for good and for bad. And so I think what we do as storytellers, and specifically through the medium of television, is that we reflect that back at people.
When you talk about this stuff, you have such a high level of self-awareness about your own life. You said you go to therapy, that you're in therapy. There's sort of a seamless way that you're able to connect what's going on in your career or what's going on in your work life with your own understanding of who you are as a person. I wonder if you think of therapy as something that's in your toolbox as a writer.
Absolutely. So I moved to LA when I was 31, going on 32 when I moved to LA.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd spent 9 full years working as a college administrator. I wasn't a counselor by trade, but such a large part of what I was doing as an administrator was working as a counselor, a surrogate mom, dad, auntie, grandparent. The process of working with young people through their issues was really enlightening and important for me in terms of my own development. And you figure I'm going to be 40 this year. So I think part of this sense of self and knowing just comes from age, just comes from growing up. But I also think absolutely therapy was critical. And it's funny because I started therapy just as my professional writing journey began. And it was that process of really unpacking, uncovering where all of my wounds lie. This is going to sound strange, but I think in the process of thinking about myself as a character, it's helped me to unlock characters on the page.
Do you approach your characters that way sometimes in the writer's room? Does your room turn into a little therapy session for the character sometimes?
Always.
Kind of the magic formula sometimes to be able to create a character-driven storyline for someone that doesn't just go A goes to B goes to C, because the way that we react as humans, it makes perfect sense, but it's not linear.
People love stories and people love television shows because it's all about conflict. But the reality is, like, if we really synthesize what that means about conflict, I mean, it really truly is about choices that have consequences. The reality is you have to spend time unpacking the truths of your character and the choices that they're making and what the very real consequences are of those choices, whether it's an external choice that then impacts people around them or internal, like an emotional impact for them as an individual. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I ever want to be involved on a show or be in a room where we're not digging in and having those conversations.
Is writing a spiritual practice for you?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, in many ways, I would say writing saved me. There are very specific periods, points in my life. The first that comes to mind is being in college and stepping into my queerness. And so I think the way I articulate it as someone who doesn't, I don't know how to swim, but I think for me, writing is like my floaties. Writing keeps me floating. It doesn't allow me to drown. What is writing for you?
I started as a poet. And yeah, I didn't think I was going to be a writer professionally. I was very precious about it. It was just for me. And it was a very therapeutic, writing in a journal, writing poems were incredibly just grounding to me, and they helped me understand myself. And I would write about other people to try to understand them. And I have to say that when I read, poetry is special this way. It remains this way for me because I have a few poets that I go to. It's like being pierced by an arrow with language, where it just goes, it like bypasses all my defenses. It bypasses all, especially if I read it out loud. It's just, I think David White, the poet David White, said that poetry is language against which we have no defenses, or something like that. When I feel that feeling, I'm just like, oh, that's right. That's right. Right. Yeah. That's what I'm doing here. Like, I know the power of this. I'm thinking about people watching this and people who are admirers of yours and who are really passionate about your show, but that they themselves are writers. And like to hear that, that your relationship to it remains more primal than that. It's not all about the pressure to produce the next great hit for FX or whatever that is. It's also about you connecting to yourself. That's kind of why I asked if it feels spiritual to you, because when you talk about writing, it feels like it certainly transcends the business of Hollywood.
I can tell you why. Is it getting too, P.S., is it too dark back here? Because I know I don't have a light on.
I still see you, and now I see all your books.
Anyhow, what I was going to say is I can tell you why the process of story is such an important and spiritual process for me. When I
Hmm.
was 15 years old, I was living in the Bronx. This was in the mid 90s. You know, we had finally come out of both the HIV, AIDS, and crack epidemics, and then we promptly stepped foot into the reemergence of gang violence in our neighborhood. I think just as a way to stay safe, I wound up joining an after school program called Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice. And I don't know if like their ethos has shifted, but at least at the time, it was all about community revitalization through art practice. And so they had young people come into the school in the afternoon and evenings, and then we had an opportunity to work on a documentary short. And the topic was turf violence. And so what we did as a group of, I think there were 9 of us that worked on this documentary short, was highlighting the violence that was now reemerging in our neighborhood and how it was impacting our classmates. About a week before completing the edit of this documentary, one of my classmates, Eva, who we worked on this film together, was shot and killed. And
Wow.
so we went from highlighting an experience in this film to suddenly having the experience and as young people. And that
Hmm.
moment at 15 for me was so, it's informed all of my creative choices, because I think the thing that I still think about to this day is who Eva would have grown up to be. You
Hmm.
know, when I look at the other 9 people who served as producers on this project, several of whom I'm still connected to, everyone is doing well, everyone's successful. I'm the only person that came out of that and is now working as a,
Uh-huh.
you know, professional storyteller. The impact of her loss and making that doc was just so, it's hard even now to put into words how deeply that death and that loss resonated for me. But I just remember feeling at the time, even at 15, like I have a responsibility now to go off and tell the stories that she's never going to get to tell.
Wow.
You know, sometimes I have to remind myself, like, Stephen, it's okay for you to enjoy what you're doing and just have fun. And I love it. Don't get me wrong. I really do love it. And I think it's so much fun. But I take the work so seriously because it means so much to me.
First of all, that's incredible that you went through that at 15. For you to be able to even really, I mean, it does take this many years, I think, to be able to sometimes look back and be like, I can actually trace a line, because while we're living it, we're just trying to kind of get through it.
Exactly. And I think most people in my life
Hmm.
would say, oh, you know, we always knew that Stephen would be doing what he's doing now because he always loved film and he always loved television. And but the reality is, I think the deeper meaning behind why it all roots back to that moment. I think it's just so critically important for anyone who's listening to us have this conversation that they really do a gut check about why they want to step into this business. If it's just for accolades or if it's just for money, then I don't know. My feeling is like, then don't do it.
There are easier ways.
Yeah,
And also the accolades don't penetrate, as you just explained. But the criticism, that'll stick. So it's not going
oh,
to work for you.
sure does.
The ego, I don't think people who come in to tame their egos are going to, if it's like coming from that place, oof, that's a rocky road. I agree.
I think there has to be something greater than yourself, some question that you are wrestling with, and you know that that's a question that you're going to take to the grave.
Do
Not
you
to
know what
be
that question is for you?
one, well, I can tell you what 2 of them are. I think one
Okay.
of them is, and this is the reason why most of the content that I've either created and or have worked on always centers around people living in New York, is why is it that New York always seems to be the epicenter for crisis? In the 80s, it was the crack epidemic. You know, New York City was the epicenter for HIV AIDS in the queer community. Now it's the epicenter in America with COVID-19. It's like, I don't understand. What is it about New York? I don't think it's as simple as population, you know, that it's just,
Mm.
it's heavily populated and that's the reason why. There's something about New York. I don't know what it is, but I'm constantly exploring that in my work. And then the other is just, I think, a simpler question, but I know for sure I'm never going to get to an answer on this one, is just why be sexist? Why be racist? Why be transphobic? Why be homophobic? There's so much like misogyny in the world. There's so like I don't get it. It's not how I raise, it's not in my personal values or morals or ethos. It's not how I navigate the world. And I'm just so confused by people who adhere so closely to beliefs that are problematic. I guess the larger overarching question for me is, why do we feel like we have the right to police other people and their choices and how they navigate the world? So that's something I know that I'm always going to be exploring in my work, is just that question of why.
There's a lot of TV shows in that one. Wow. I couldn't tell you. Yeah, that's a question I ask myself a lot. I don't think it's in like the central core of my being the way it is for you. I have like some relate. If you take two lefts, you'll find my questions, right?
What are your questions?
um, well, shit, I should have those ready. If I'm going to ask people questions, I should know what my answers are, right? Fuck. I am constantly wrestling with the truth that I believe, which is that things are essentially unfair. I was raised by immigrants who were refugees, both my parents, and like these sort of PTSD battered Eastern Europeans who would just be like, Sarah, life isn't fair. So I'm not surprised when people act small. I'm not surprised when they choose tribalism over humanity. That stuff doesn't usually shock me, but I also can't reconcile it. I think this is such a beautiful thing. It's like when you boil it down to those burning essential questions, like, by the way, I'm really not okay with the fact that we die. Like, that shit's not okay with me. And that I don't get to know if that's the end or something else is coming. Like, I love all the beautiful stories about it, but I don't know if I believe any of them. And I will probably never stop writing about that. I'm just not cool with my mortality. I'm not cool with yours. But when we get in touch with that, then we're in like universal language territory. Like, we have that in common, no matter where you were born, though I was also born in the Bronx, no matter where you were born, right? No matter who you are, how you identify, it's like those little thorns that stick into our soul. If you can feel those inside you and just want to start to explore them, knowing you'll probably never answer the question to your own satisfaction, right?
What you just said just made me think about the beauty of difference and diversity, and how I wish, I guess going back to what I was saying is my core question, how I wish that we would just embrace that, right? Because here's the thing, what you just articulated is absolutely parallel to what I said. So we have this overlap, this shared question, and yet if that's one of the tenets that we use to navigate our careers, look at how it's played out differently for you versus for me, right? When you compare you, or you compare the magicians to Pose, like those three things couldn't be any different, right? And yet the core, the kernel of it all that exists is the same. God, how beautiful the world is that you could have two people who could have shared value, and yet the work be so completely different. So there's beauty in the diversity of the work that he created, and yet we don't give that same credit. We just don't honor that in the same way when it comes to us as people. And that makes me sad. Like, we're so hung up on our differences as opposed to honoring that we are different, and look at how beautiful we can still find a way to be connected.
I do wish we could bottle it and just throw it into the street. But what I'm settling for is being a little bit on a soapbox as a writer and a person who invites people to ask me questions on the internet sometimes, and just say, like, you have to push the committee out of the way because we need your voice. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you come from. The more, the merrier. It's not a competition. Honestly, if we're going to get any closer to any of these human truths, I think it has to be group sourced. It's like, I sometimes have like a little glimmer of illumination when I watch something that someone else made, where I see the humanity in it, and I'm like, oh, I just touched it for a second because they touched it for a second and they let me see it another way.
The other thing that comes to mind is, I think particularly for new writers or folks who are looking to break in, who are listening to this conversation, it's so important to redefine success for yourself. There's so few people who reach the level that we are at. And like, we are privileged to be in a place where we can say, I've created a show. Or in your case, shows plural, right? And like, how incredible that is. Like, that is a feat, and that's something that we talked a lot about when I was at UCLA, right? Is like, if we're looking at Hollywood as being like a bullseye, then, very few people ever actually hit right in the middle. And so a lot of folks wind up sort of spending time working their way in. And the reality is, like, not everybody wants to be in the middle. And I think it's just important for everyone to just consider, like, what does success look like for you? Because for some folks, it isn't going to be being the showrunner, being the show creator, being the all things to all people. So whatever works for you is what's most important.
I think that's very true. I mean, I've talked to people who write books at their kitchen table very successfully, but write books at their kitchen table because their priority was to control their creative worlds and be there for their children. And, the job we do is really fun and it's also really stressful, but people who were watching this who want to dip a toe in, it's like the conversation you and I are having about the conversation with a capital C that you can be a part of if you're an artist. The only cost of admission is a willingness to ask questions you don't have the answers to. That shit, it doesn't matter what your job is.
Yeah.
It just matters how, much focused practice you are willing to bring to your work.
Amen.
You can do that in a pandemic. This has been so interesting.
Yeah,
I love talking to you.
Likewise.
I can't wait to do it maybe in a room where we're both in the same one.
With drinks over dinner. Sounds great.